Tonight on KQED Newsroom, the fight over impeachment ratchets up. And we'll get the latest on this week's revelations and recriminations. Also, a surprise announcement from San Francisco's top prosecutor jolts the race to elect his successor. Plus, a new survey gauges the mood of California voters from concerns about the state's future to the toughest issues facing the state. Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Michael Krasny. We begin tonight with the latest developments in the impeachment inquiry of President Trump. Earlier today, the three House committees leading the impeachment investigation demanded documents from Vice President Mike Pence about the White House's dealings with Ukraine. And yesterday, the committees interviewed Kurt Volker, a former special envoy to Ukraine. Among their findings, texts and documents suggesting that top State Department officials worked on getting a statement of support from Ukraine's president to investigate Democratic presidential rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Also this week, President Trump told reporters that China should open an investigation into Biden and his son. Joining me now are KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos, and joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. is NPR senior editor and correspondent Ron Elving. And welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Pleased to have you both here. Ron Elving, let me begin with you, and let's begin by talking about the newest revelation with respect to Vice President Pence. What do we know, and where's this going?
The House leaders have sent notice to the vice president saying they want to see every document that might exist, that might pertain to meetings that Mike Pence might have had with the Ukrainian president, perhaps with others in Ukraine. They want to know everything that he knows about the interchanges between our government at the highest levels, that is to say President Trump, and the Ukrainian president with respect to investigations of the Bidens, and also with respect to what the president has been saying. And we saw this in those envoy messages that you referred to a moment ago. The quid pro quo, which seems to be quite explicit, at least in the minds of those envoys, those people in our State Department delegation there in Kiev, that the president was saying, if you want this aid that Congress has appropriated and that everyone seems to be for, you've got to give me something on this investigation.
These were not perfect texts, then, I take it, as the president characterized his phone call.
Well, he called it a perfect phone call. Some people are calling these smoking texts, a reference, obviously, to a smoking gun.
And what do you suspect will go on with Michael Atkinson, who's the IG for the intelligence community? He's going to be testifying on Friday.
This is the idea of it is that he's going to defend his handling of the whistleblower's complaint. Now, that complaint came to him directly, and he checked it out to his own satisfaction to be able to say he found it credible and urgent and serious, and then passed it on to the director of national intelligence, his superior, for further action. We know that because that individual, Joseph Maguire, has appeared before the House Intelligence Committee last week. So this is further checking of the legitimacy of the whistleblower's complaint that is driving this whole process.
Marisa, Joseph Maguire didn't find it necessarily all that credible, though, did he?
No, and I think that this speaks to the different sort of ways that, different members of the administration are trying to spin this versus the way the Democrats view it. But what I would say is that every single piece of evidence that has come out since Adam Schiff first stood up and sort of made that cryptic announcement about this whistleblower complaint has really played into Democratic hands, not Republicans. I mean, these text messages that Ron was just talking about are really very explicit in terms of the concern that was being raised within the administration and their sense that maybe the words quid pro quo was not used, but that there was basically a sense that it was that. And so I think that whatever the Inspector General says, it has to be taken in the context of everything else, as well as the other State Department officials, including Mike Pompeo, who has obviously hit back almost as hard as his boss, President Trump.
There's even somewhat of a sense now, let me go to you on this, Ron Elving, that maybe China's being offered a kind of quid pro quo here. That is, President Trump, like he did with Hillary Clinton when he said, Russia, if you're listening, where are those emails? He's sort of saying to China, if you got something on my political opponent here, let me know about it. And we're supposed to be going trade war with China.
Well, we're supposed to be hearing from some people from China coming to the United States next week. And the context of that request to China came in the same driveway conversation between the president and some of the people covering him, in which he said, I have tremendous power over these trade negotiations. The Chinese really need a deal. They need to make a deal. I think they ought to make a deal. but maybe we will and maybe we won't. We don't really have to. And then on to talking about China investigating the Bidens.
Marisa, here in California, we're hearing from Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi about the president violating his oath of office. This keeps coming up, came up from both of them. What are we making of that?
I mean, I think that this is really at the crux of why Democrats are moving now with this latest scandal, why they did not, go as far as they have, especially Pelosi, with the Russia investigation, with the emoluments questions, all these other things. They feel like this is a clear-cut case that they can make to the American public, that essentially by, making this demand of Ukraine, that is a violation of the oath of office. And I think it's really, in a lot of ways, a strategic talking point from a public relations standpoint, as much as a legal argument, because they think they can make both and that it's something that people understand very clearly.
And another California politician, Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, said that this probe should be dropped. There's not enough evidence. There's not enough transparency, all the things along those lines. It seems like not only has Nancy Pelosi dug in, but she pretty much said nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin McCarthy is very close to the president. He has called him my Kevin at one point. I think that he, is doing what the White House would like in sending this letter, but maybe bad timing on his part. The letter was being transmitted right as the president was making those comments in the White House, outside the White House, about China digging in on the Ukrainian stuff. And I think it gave Pelosi a very clear sort of opening to say, look, we're not going to drop this. It's true, to Kevin McCarthy's point, that in the last 2 impeachment investigations, there was a vote taken to launch those investigations. But what Pelosi says is, I don't need to, I don't have to, and I'm in control, which, we often hear from Mitch McConnell, too. So that's not unique to one party.
Well, these parties are about as antithetical and as partisan as they can possibly be. What does that mean in terms of the fact that we're seeing a whistleblower having been identified as a Democrat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that the Trump administration and their allies are going to keep trying to hammer on. I think it will be increasingly hard to make that point when we see mounting evidence like those text messages where those concerns were actually being called out by the administration officials themselves behind closed doors. But certainly, this is what we saw during the Hillary Clinton election and the accusations with the State Department and the various sort of accusations the president made. And so I think that is their political play. If we can make this appear partisan, then we can sort of take the heat off ourselves and point it back at the Democrats.
Let me go back to Ron Elving. Ron Elving, let's talk about the role of Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer in all this, who really kind of got things started with respect to Ukraine, didn't he?
To some degree, although it was also started to some degree by some people in the conservative media who had been writing that Joe Biden had some exposure for some of the things that he said while he was vice president with regard to a corruption investigation in Ukraine. Now, what he was trying to do was get the corruption investigation to go forward and get rid of a prosecutor who was blocking it. But that was turned around to suggest that somehow he was trying to end the corruption probe. That was started some time ago. Rudy Giuliani has been part of spreading that particular interpretation. He has done it through the media. He's done it through visits with a number of our allies in different countries, always appearing only as the president's personal lawyer. Now, it's interesting that he is not part of the government. He does not have a role in the government, but he is conducting what appears very much to be our foreign policy business, as though he had the authority to do so, just as the president's personal lawyer. And there's also in the background of this some effort that's been made in the past by the Russians to say that the Ukrainians were responsible for the 2016 election interference, which all of our intelligence community has agreed was done by the Russians. The Russians say, no, that was the Ukrainians doing that, and they were framing us and trying to make it look like we did it. And at this point, it appears that Giuliani and to some degree the president have been playing into that particular interpretation.
Marisa, how's this affecting the Biden campaign? I mean, it looks bad that he had a son who had no experience, got on this Burisma board in Ukraine, getting $50,000 a month, and also the tie to China, an investment firm.
I mean, I think that's the problem for Biden, is not that obviously there's been any foundation of wrongdoing, but just the appearance of it. And I think that every time his name gets brought up in the same sentence as Trump and corruption in Ukraine, it sort of yokes them in a way that is not helpful to the Biden campaign. Now, Biden's campaign has other challenges as well. We saw the fundraising numbers come out this week. He is lagging far behind the other two frontrunners, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. But you have to imagine that the narrative around him sort of not being right for the job right now is something that, as we get closer to the primary and it might get a little more heated among these Democrats who have been pretty nice to each other so far, that they might really lean into. I think this week what we've seen is Democrats trying to have a unified front. Kamala Harris was in Oakland last weekend saying leave Joe Biden alone. But I don't anticipate that's going to hold as things get closer to the primaries in the Iowa caucus.
Ron, I need to ask you, are we kind of in no man's land here? We don't know, for example, where we're going, what the trajectory of this is. It's not as if you can suddenly map it out by previous impeachments, even the charges that were brought against President Nixon. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. Again, non-normal.
It's not normal largely because President Trump's presidency is quite different from its predecessors. Bill Clinton reacted differently. Richard Nixon reacted differently. I wasn't quite available for the Andrew Johnson impeachment in 1868, but assume that all of these is a little bit different. Still, there are some rough guidelines in the Constitution. We do know the House is supposed to go first. We do know the Senate is supposed to have a formal trial of the House's charges. We do know that the Supreme Court Chief Justice is supposed to preside. And we may see all of that unfold as we did with Clinton and as we would have if Richard Nixon had not resigned in the face of that process.
Many thanks to both of you. Marisa Lagos, Ron Elving, appreciate your being with us.
Thanks, Michael.
On Thursday, San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon announced his resignation to explore entering the DA race in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, the race to elect a new district attorney in San Francisco is an open contest with 4 candidates vying to be the city's next top prosecutor. And on November 5th, voters in San Francisco will get to cast their ballots in that closely watched contest, as well as decide the fate of 6 local ballot measures. Joining us now are 2 of those candidates, Alameda County Deputy District Attorney Nancy Tung and California Deputy Attorney General Leif Douch. And welcome. Good to have you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Let me begin, Nancy, with you. With the resignation of George Gascon, it brings up the question of what kind of job do you feel he did, and maybe where was that job in need of some serious rectifying, and what would you do to rectify?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because we can look at the last 8 years in San Francisco and see what's happening on our streets isn't working. I think that George Gascon had a very substantive agenda in terms of criminal justice reform, but when it comes to the bread and butter of prosecution work, he failed greatly. We have skyrocketing property crime rates. We have the highest property crime rate in the nation and the highest per capita crime rate in the state of California. And so I think whoever comes in next needs to be somebody who can tackle those law enforcement issues and really do a good job helping the people of San Francisco have safe streets.
Thank you. Leif Douch, where do you stand on Gascon's record?
Well, I actually filed last year to run against George Gascon for district attorney because I thought that he had put his political ambition above the well-being of everyday San Franciscans. And I think the news yesterday that he is abandoning his post to run for the same office in Los Angeles confirms those suspicions. I filed to run because of the highest in the nation property crime rates that Nancy mentioned. The fact that he has not delivered justice for victims of violent crime or sexual assault, and the fact that the relationships between communities of color and law enforcement is as bad as it's ever been, and he's managed to alienate both of those communities.
Time permitting, we'll get into all these issues, but what I'm really concerned about now is what Californians seem to be most concerned about. New poll, PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California, says the biggest concern is homelessness. And homelessness, of course, ties in with drug abuse and it ties in with mental illness. And so let's talk to you, Lee, first about what you envision in terms of homelessness and ameliorating the problem.
I've been the only candidate in this race that from the very beginning has been laser focused on homelessness and mental health. Our plan is to take Juvenile Hall, which is 80% empty and the city has voted to shut down, and turn that into a mental health justice center. So a 150-bed facility for those on the streets battling serious mental illness. It's one thing to say that those battling mental illness shouldn't be in our county jails or in our courtrooms, but they shouldn't be on our streets either. We need a robust mental health system for them to get the help they need, and Juvenile Hall is a perfect opportunity to do that.
Nancy, let's go right to you on this.
Sure.
Envision.
I think I take a very pragmatic approach to these issues on San Francisco's streets. One of them is, as a district attorney, can you be an advocate for certain policy positions? And I definitely want to make sure that we push a policy position that addresses homelessness, drug addiction, and mental health issues before crimes occur. On the separate side of actual law enforcement, when people become involved in the criminal justice system, we need to take an approach that is thoughtful about what happens in terms of where they are, where we have an opportunity to collaborate and get people services, but also to make sure there's accountability for people who actually harm other people even if it's due to mental illness or drug addiction, let's have some accountability. Let's keep our people safe on the streets and make sure that San Franciscans have a way forward so that we have a city that is safe for everybody.
You both have large visions, and large visions are going to cost a lot in revenue. And so let's hear what you have to say. Nancy, I'll begin with you about particularly budgetary issues and how you can get the kind of funds you're going to need.
Well, I think we need to be very lean about how we approach the DA's office going forward. Right now, there are staffing issues and vacancies, so in order to backfill them, I think we need to take that approach first and then see how we can streamline the DA's office in a way that makes more efficiencies with the attorneys that we have. Right now, I know that there are ways that we can improve services to the constituents of San Francisco and improve safety without expanding the budget. And then I'll take a look in my administration where we need to have more funding and ask the Board of Supervisors for that.
Well, in this context, let me go to you, Lee. What about the relationship that you can forge with the Board of Supervisors and the mayor? How important, how central is that?
It's critical. I was the president of the Juvenile Probation Commission, so I oversaw a $42 million budget, a 240-person city department. So on an annual basis, I would go in and meet with the Board of Supervisors and the mayor to iron out that budget. So I've got experience there. I'm also the only candidate in this race who is both a prosecutor and who manages a team of prosecutors on a day-to-day basis at the AG's office. So I'm ready to step in on day one and iron that out. Now, with regard to your question about the budget, we don't need to expand our budget. Let's use the resources and attorneys we have in the office right now in a better way. Currently, managers in the office are not actively litigating cases. We need to get them back into the courtroom. And then there's things like this DMV grant program at the state level that provides matching dollars to cities and counties that come up with innovative ways to tackle property crime. So I've talked about creating a 5-person auto burglary task force to make sure that we're able to go after the organized rings breaking into cars. That can be funded by this DMV grant program without raising our budget at all.
All right, I'm going to segue easily into what you're going to do about criminal justice and particularly diminishing the crime, not only talking about property crime, but of course violent crime as well.
Absolutely. Now, the model for me here is the juvenile justice system, where everything is really focused on rehabilitation and reducing recidivism rates. And we've been successful focusing on those underlying root causes, whether it's a mental health issue, substance abuse, gang, economic opportunity. I want to take that rehabilitative focus and expand it to the adult system, beginning with transitional age youth, 18 to 24-year-olds, and show that that rehabilitative model is the best way to go, both for their interest and for the interest of the general public and for public safety. We do that for 18 to 24-year-olds and show that it works. We can expand it to the entire adult system.
Well, let me go right to Nancy on this. And Nancy, you've been talking about restorative justice and the importance of restorative justice. There's a danger there, isn't there, that maybe there will be more lawless people on the streets? That's what one often hears.
Right, and I think restorative justice has a place in our criminal justice system. I mean, we employ it right now in neighborhood courts and nonviolent crimes. I think that is a good space for it. Restorative justice in terms of determining sentences, though, I think, especially in violent crime cases, is not necessarily where we want to have the end-all be-all of restorative justice. But to have that conversation between victims of crime and also offenders, I think, is important. It's important to facilitate it, but that should not be the final determining factor on how a person is sentenced, in my view.
What about use of force?
Use of force, I think, is an important question with respect to law enforcement. We have changed the use of force laws in California, and I think it'll be interesting to see how the courts interpret it. The legislation in itself doesn't necessarily define all the terms, and so it'll be subject to interpretation.
Well, again, there's concern that maybe too many people will be out of jail as a result.
I think that it's going to be an enforcement challenge, and we need to approach changes in our laws in a way that we are flexible and we are adaptive. And I think that's one of the big shortcomings of Prop 47 is that San Francisco failed to adapt to the changes in the law in a way that continued to protect public safety and property.
Let me go to you on this, Lee Douch.
Yeah, for use of force, when we're talking about police accountability, the next district attorney has to be able to do two things at the same time, to walk and chew gum at the same time, if you will. Hold law enforcement accountable when they engage in misconduct, and I'm committed to doing that, making charging decisions within 6 months, holding a town hall to explain my charging decision. But on the other 99% of cases that don't involve official misconduct, we have to be able to work together on the murder cases, on the sexual assault cases, on the home invasions. And I think it's that balance that's earned me the endorsements of over 150 groups, including our firefighters and our deputy sheriffs right here in San Francisco.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both, and good luck to both of you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Run hard. This week, the Public Policy Institute of California released a new poll reflecting the mood of voters and their top concerns. Homelessness and jobs were cited most often as the most important issues affecting the state. Also, there was bad news for Democratic presidential candidate and California Senator Kamala Harris, whose support among likely voters in the state has slipped to just 8%. And for the first time since 2015, more than half of likely voters think the state is heading in the wrong direction. Joining us now is the CEO and president of the Public Policy Institute of California, Mark Baldessari. Mark, good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Very nice to see you.
Why this optimism going south? And I don't mean to Los Angeles. I mean, what have you found is behind this decline in optimism?
54% of likely voters say that the state is headed in the wrong direction, and 54% of likely voters also say that they feel that the economy is going to have bad times over the next 12 months. So I think a combination of political turmoil and economic uncertainty really catching up with people, and they're very nervous right now.
And the biggest problem still is homelessness and jobs.
The first time ever in the 20 years that we've been doing polling, we saw homelessness as tied now with jobs. It's not unusual to see jobs, but homelessness, jobs, housing costs, and immigration were the top issues in our poll. First time ever for homelessness.
I was really struck by the fact that 2/3 of those that you talked to want stronger gun laws.
Yes, 2/3 want stronger gun laws, and I was also struck by the fact that 2/3 said that they're worried about the possibility of mass shooting in the area in which they live. Now, this poll was taken after the Gilroy mass shooting, and it tells you the extent to which there's fear now and there's a desire to do something about gun laws.
You also did a presidential poll, as I mentioned in the introduction, and what does it mean that Kamala Harris has slipped so much?
Well, you know, in our poll, we found that most people said that they are very closely following the election, which is kind of unusual for this early. And most people also said that they think that the debates are very important in deciding who to vote for in this presidential election. In our first poll, when we saw Kamala Harris leading all other candidates, this was right after a very strong performance in the first debate. This last poll was taken after the third debate. And I guess the second and third debate performances, other candidates have performed more strongly than she has.
Well, you know, there's a good deal of skepticism about polls, and I want to find out your thoughts about this and the methodology you use, which gives you perhaps more faith in what you're doing.
So we have stuck with the random digit dial telephone using cell phone and landline and live telephone interviewers, which the reason that we use that methodology is because the national polls still consider that so-called high-quality polling. All polling is very difficult today because it's hard to reach people, but over time the accuracy has been better with the live telephone interviewing, so we've stuck with that.
So how does this turn into policy? I mean, and what kind of impact does it have on the citizenry?
Well, I think that the fact that voters in this state are very worried about a number of issues that aren't being resolved by either federal government or state government at this point, means that they're looking for candidates for president who have a plan and who can create some hope. And then at the local level, the fact that people are getting more nervous about the economy makes it more difficult for bond measures and tax measures next year. We also saw this in our poll with weak support, both for the school bond measure in March, as well as the measure to change property tax laws in the state to provide more funding for schools.
Yeah, I was struck by that, more funding, desire for more funding for school construction, and actually for greater action on climate change. I'm not sure how that translates. You thought about that?
Yeah. Well, the support for climate change, I think, is something that we have seen in all of our polls, and a lot of that is related to the fact that many people are now worried about natural disasters, particularly fire. In our state. And as people have experienced natural disasters that are related to climate change, they want more actions from state government.
What about Democrats? Should they be worried as a result of your polling?
Well, we are a solidly blue state.
I think absolutely solidly blue, yes.
Yeah. A Republican hasn't won in a statewide race since 2006, and that would have been back to Arnold
When
Schwarzenegger.
people are unhappy and when they're feeling pessimistic, maybe there could be a shift. Huh?
So if you're a Democrat who's an incumbent, especially because we have a top two primary system where there could be two Democrats running against each other, I think those are the Democrats who should be worried, the ones who are the incumbents and the ones who are in the legislature right now, because both the Congress and the state legislature are getting low ratings. The Congress much lower, 24%, but 51% said that they're not happy with the state legislature today.
And how does that translate? What are they unhappy about?
Problems that aren't being
Problems
solved.
that we've already cited?
Yeah,
Are there others that we need to cover here?
Well, I think that health care costs is also a great concern for Californians, and I think that also for many Californians, the fear of deportation due to increased federal enforcement. We found 4 out of 10 people in our poll, and about half of Latinos, about half of lower-income Californians said that they're afraid that somebody they know is going to be deported.
So that includes election integrity, obviously. Huh?
That's right, yeah.
And this goes to Sacramento. Do you get action often from the legislators?
Oh, they pay attention. You know, they pay attention beyond their approval rating, but of course their approval rating is what they look at the most. But
and where the checks are coming from.
That's right. They pay attention to the fact that not only what the voters think, but what the people who they represent think. So that's one of the reasons that in our methodology, we've stayed with interviewing all adults, not just the likely voters.
And what about the independent voters or those voters who are undecided? What did you find?
Most of them are leaning Democratic. Many of them want to participate in the primary. Most of them are very unhappy with Donald Trump, but they tend to be more fiscally conservative. And that's the thing that Democrats, especially those incumbents running for office, need to take into account.
Is California still a resistant state as far as the Trump administration?
Well, you know, Donald Trump's approval rating has been in the 30 to 35% range since he's been elected. It hasn't changed. It hasn't budged even over the last few weeks in our polling. But there's still very, very strong opposition to Donald Trump and to the policies that he's proposing.
Mark Baldessari, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Michael Krasny. Thanks for joining us.